Welcome to Talking Economics, a podcast by CERGE-EI, the Center for Economic Research and Graduate Education, Economics Institute, founded in 1991 in Prague. We invite our faculty, researchers, and alumni from around the world to discuss current economic research and its relevance to the challenges and opportunities in a changing world. I'm your host, Katarina Stehlíková. Thank you for joining us. Why do some people build dream careers while others get stuck searching? What drives wage gaps? And what role do families play in it all? Luca Mazzone, assistant professor at CERGE-EI and economist at the IMF, unpacks the frictions of the labor market, the role of family ties, and why understanding sorting patterns between workers, firms, family members, and entrepreneurs is essential for economic policy. Welcome, Luca.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I will start on a personal note. What did initially draw you to labor economics, and specifically to looking at search and matching models?
Oh, that's a great question. So when I started my journey into economics, I was always drawn into macroeconomics because I'd always had the feeling that it was about the big questions, the relevant questions. Search and matching models and macro labor are often about what some say is who gets what and why, which I think is a very good way to describe when you're doing the analysis of macro dynamics. You're taking into account how heterogeneity fits in. Macro is interesting to me in that context because it's not only about this allocation and who gets what and why, but also when fundamentals change or when maybe preferences change or when the distribution changes, the effects can be surprising because they play out in equilibrium.
One of the big topics in macro, in general in society, is the inequality, and specifically also the wage inequality. Can you tell us something about how important is the worker-firm sorting in explaining the current trends?
Sure. So sorting is technically, right, which workers go to which firms, and it is at this point a fairly classic topic, a fairly classic approach to macro labor. Specifically, we say that an economy is strongly sorted if the better workers are employed at the better firms, where we say better in the sense of more productive or more skilled. So the sense we get from the literature is that the role of sorting, which means the extent to which workers are paired with firms of similar quality, is significant. Part of my research is to understand not only how sorting plays out in explaining the current distribution of earnings and so inequality, but also how dynamically sorting affects growth or the way economies recover from recessions, or in other ways, how sorting affects the impact of policies. And that means that because sorting is an endogenous response by workers and firms, or between workers or between individuals, the way in which they choose which other agents to match with is an important aspect of an evaluation of, say, the impact of business cycles, or the understanding of migration trends, or the understanding of policies that aim at preserving employment levels.
Mm-hmm. In looking at the sorting, you usually look at some frictions and matching inefficiencies. Can you tell us more about what specifically are these frictions and efficiencies?
Sure. Search frictions are based on the idea that when you're assigning workers to firms, in theory, you're thinking about what is the ideally best match for each of them. In practice, there are obstacles to the matching of individuals or workers and firms, or a classic example, there's frictions in the marriage market. These frictions can take multiple practical forms, right? It might be hard to find a plumber. You don't know who is the best plumber, and you're just calling multiple of them until someone accepts your call. And from the perspective of the plumbers, they receive calls that arrive from potential customers. And this is a framework that, if you want, is closer to what economists call random search. An alternative idea or alternative way to look at search frictions is assuming that, like, we all know where we want to go, but that more popular spots or more popular sellers can have a longer queue. So there's many ice cream shops that we like, but the best ones, we might have to wait a lot to get an ice cream. And so the way to organize a market where there are customers of, say, people who want to eat an ice cream, and there are ice cream sellers, is to understand that the trade might not be instant, but it might take wait. And the trade-off between waiting time and quality is an important organizational aspect of these markets.
How do you see these inefficiencies changing over time when there are all these technological advances, right? There are new digital platforms and remote work, so we have, like, the markets are larger in a sense. So how do you see these changes and their impact?
That's a very good question. There have been exceptional papers talking about this fundamental changes in the economy. I think the first puzzle that economists had to grapple with was this observation that while apparently search cost would have to go down because of, say, the internet, the dispersion of price and quality did not go down. So you would imagine that a good justification for having search frictions in models, or thinking about search frictions, is to say, well, because there are search frictions, then firms or sellers in general can post very different prices, and these prices don't equalize because they're not sold at the same time at the same place. And then online marketplaces emerge, and price dispersion in online marketplaces is enormous. So this left an open agenda for many scholars to understand, like, okay, maybe we still have a lot to learn. Another way to look at this is to say unemployment, for instance, right? Is unemployment just an effect of how hard it is to match workers to firms? And it certainly in some way is, but you would have imagined that the level of unemployment on average would go down in the past 20, 30 years because of the decline in search frictions. And this is not being observed.
And the unemployment effect, we are trying to balance it out by the insurance programs, right? Which are aimed to balance the incentives for job search and providing the economic security. What is your assessment of these programs? Are they effective?
Well, there's a variety of programs that are related to unemployment risk, and I would take your question with a little of a step back, and then maybe I'll give you a broader answer. So why do we care about this? The first answer to this is that unemployment risk comes from, say, particularly idiosyncratic risk, and in the sense that you can be employed at a company, you don't know exactly how that company, how solid that company is, and you lose your job, and this is a risk that as a society we might want to insure. More broadly, though, there are periods, there are recessions when large numbers of companies lay off workers and when finding jobs is harder in general. A part of my research is to ask, when recessions hits, do we actually get the benefits of these firms shutting down and these workers separating from their jobs in the sense of a sort of survival of the fittest or cleansing? So do we end up with an economy that has better properties, better productivity? And the research we did is basically saying the opposite, that yes, there are initially, when a recession hits, some productivity enhancing shifts. But in the end, we don't end up with an economy where better, larger firms grow their employment share and that the economy is more productive. Rather, we end up with both a distribution of jobs that is shifted to the left, the jobs are less productive, and in particular, the workers are accumulating less human capital. So, to go back to your initial question, it does make sense to some degree to insure workers and jobs. And then the question becomes, are we better off insuring the jobs themselves, that is, keeping workers on the job, or insuring workers, which means even if workers lose their job, we want them to preserve their earnings? A follow-up paper that we are working on is exploring the conditions under which it is optimal to preserve the jobs. And there again, the important aspect of why a job will want to be preserved has to deal with how workers and firms end up being paired with each other. So an efficient job retention scheme or furlough scheme, or depending on the country you're talking about, the institutional features might be slightly different, but an efficient program of that sort is a program that allows the economy to come out of recessions with an improved sorting between workers and firms. In that context, then, unemployment insurance should be thought of as sort of a residual program for the jobs that we are not willing to keep in place. And there, the usual trade-offs are in place. There's an insurance component, and there is a moral hazard component, and which means like workers are going to be willing to stay unemployed for longer if their unemployment risk is insured. And finally, there is another component which is complementary to this moral hazard, which is maybe workers are more willing to search for better matches if they are insured and they have more time. I think that on the trade-off between this moral hazard and better sorting, there is still fairly open research. I think recent papers on, say, the introduction of UBI did not offer particularly comforting evidence that a form of unconditional insurance into unemployment improves job search. At the same time, a well-designed scaling down of benefits, as I would say was not the case during the pandemic, or not necessarily the case during the pandemic everywhere, but research using data from the post-pandemic years shows that timing the phase-out has important implications for the willingness of workers to accept jobs, so that it has large effects on the duration of unemployment.
Here I would maybe ask you, these are quite specific questions that need to be answered for good policy recommendations. And your research is using structural economic modeling, which is significantly more complicated, I would say, than the purely empirical and theoretical approaches. What would you say are the benefits of your approach, and also then specifically towards the policy advice?
I would say that the decision between using structural models versus having a purely empirical, or as some would say, reduced form approach is not a general decision. It has to do with the question. I would say that my instinct is to say that the simplest approach, the more transparent approach, is always the one that we should favor, both because we should aim at making science that is replicable, understandable, transparent, not very context dependent. This is often not so easy, not so simple. There are questions where strategic interactions of the actors involved are important, where the dynamics that plays out cannot be simply described with some conditional statistics. And in these cases, you are often better off, even if the question is just understanding what's going on in the world, which is a type of research, if you want to know. Like, often research in economics is about trying to understand the effect of a specific policy or program. But more fundamentally, we often should do research in trying to understand how the world works. And there are instances in which, even to understand basic facts about the world, we would need to rely on a little bit of structure that comes from theory.
In order to design policy, you need models, you need to understand, but you need to understand the data. To what extent are the data available for the labor market in the European Union and then compared to the US?
So this is a very important subject and topic of conversation that the scientific community of the economists, but not only the economists, I think should be more vocal about. Data availability is crucial. We rely on administrative data in most cases for my research, be it from the US or Italy or France or Germany. And this data is costly to maintain. It is usually maintained by public agencies, the Social Security Administration in Italy, or the Treasury, or the Census in the United States. And one big concern recently is that successive administrations in particularly in the United States have been not particularly interested in investing in maintaining this infrastructure. This extends beyond the data I use, and it's more fundamental. It's connected to producing the best science. It's connected to having databases and data sources that are, to some extent, accessible to all researchers. And if we do believe that social sciences provide knowledge that is useful for the public and for policymaking, then the returns to making these investments, despite the investment being apparently large, the returns can be massive.
I wanted to move to your work that is looking at intra-household allocations and bargaining. Can you tell us more about why is it important to understand the household dynamics, and how does it relate to the broader economic policy?
Well, intra-household allocation is perhaps the most important allocative problem of everyone's lives. The economic decisions that we take outside of the household are very dependent on the allocations inside the household. This is true in a way for both genders, right? So while it's true that one of the most important macroeconomic facts of the past decades, and then it depends on which decades, In the United States, it's maybe the 70s and the 80s. In some European countries, it's the 80s, the 90s, or the 2000s, is the increase in labor force participation of women, right? And the labor force participation of women going closer to the labor force participation of men, and that comes together with better schooling outcomes and higher graduation college rates of women, have implications for labor market themselves, for intra-household allocation, and then in turn again on labor markets. So the study of how social norms shape the participation of women, their ability to build careers, how this whole thing interact with fertility decisions, I think are probably the biggest questions of our age, particularly because we are currently facing two issues, right? One issue is our economies our populations are aging as a result of, I would say, young couples not being able to find the conditions under which having the number of children that they would like to have. And the second problem is trying to understand how we can revive productivity in periods of big, deep structural change that is going to be brought upon new technology, especially AI. So a changing landscape of labor markets and a decline in population both go through what happens inside of the household, how the tasks are divided, who takes care of whom, when there are less siblings to rely on, who is going to take care of aging parents. All these questions are very important. They're first order. They probably matter more than many mainstream classic economic questions going forward.
How would you say that the traditional economic models captured this complexity?
Fairly well. If you look at the I would say if you look at the best research on household bargaining or on joint decisions or decisions that are taken within the household, it seems to me that two things can both be true at the same time. And the thing number one is individuals are not motivated narrowly by economic considerations. And at the same time, economic models do a very good job at modeling how people actually behave. I think that's because a good approach on economic modeling does allow for including the relevant non-monetary considerations into the analysis when needed. And then it's the task of the modeler to understand which are the important non-monetary considerations, be it altruism or the willingness to have a certain path or amenities. And there are, I think, undervalued properties in the ability of economic analysis to capture individual behavior. The mistake that I think many people inside and outside of economics make is to take the narrow view that economic models talk only about monetary or economic considerations. And what we can do instead is to use economic tools to talk about agents that are not necessarily selfish, not necessarily economically motivated, but still behave within certain boundaries with what we would call in economics rationality, which is a certain consistency between the objectives and the means to achieve them.
Thank you. Now I would like to ask a very different question, because you have experience with work in academia. You returned to academia, so working at CERGE-EI, but before you worked at IMF. So could you tell us more about the key differences between these two jobs?
So those are two career paths that I think I was privileged enough to experience in my postgraduate school years. I had a great run at the IMF in my years there. I met fantastic colleagues, and I had the experience of meeting government leaders of countries of very different extraction, and I would say also levels of technical capabilities that were surprisingly high. The job of an IMF economist is a job of breadth. It's a job of trying to understand complex problems across specializations in a relatively small, short amount of time. So an IMF economist is a person who is able to talk confidently to the central bank governor of a G20 country and then about topics of monetary policy or surveillance, and then in the same day have a serious conversation about labor market reform with the Ministry of Labor. I think this is very exciting and I enjoyed doing it. My main motivation for moving into academia, I think, has to do with the fact that my inclination is to be a little bit more obsessed about going into the depth of discovering why certain things work in a certain way. And a second big motivation was to be able to have complete agency on what the priorities of my work was going to be. Of course, while the IMF is a very informal organization for being a bureaucracy, I think people are surprised often when they join by how collegial it feels. It still is a place where you have a boss. Your boss is a boss, and your boss and your boss's boss has shareholders. And so the priorities are defined to some extent in a top-down manner. Academia is more horizontal. Then, of course, some say that because academia is more horizontal and everyone is just pursuing their own objectives, so the general stakes of every single thing are very low, and that makes fights and disagreements more petty. This is Henry Kissinger, who went from being, academic to Secretary of State, and he said, well, the environment as Secretary of State was nicer, but that is, I suppose, normal. When you give people a lot of independence and they're happy to have it, then there's less to be concerned about, structure and authority. I am feeling great in this, right? I am enjoying my new path. I am enjoying the independence it gives me and the ability to choose who to work with and when. But if I were to advise young graduates today, I would say, look, there are great things in both. Look at what is your deepest inclination, what is your deepest desire, and follow that. But if you happen to be uncertain, both things are great. And I think my story will tell you also that it is possible to move from one great institution doing one thing to another that is equally great at doing the other.
Awesome. As we are reflecting on your career, which of your research contributions are you most proud of, and why?
As of now, more than my theoretical contributions necessarily, but my broader contribution so far, or to say the best piece of work I have had the privilege to contribute to is my paper with my two co-authors on the collapse of human capital ladder. I briefly mentioned it before. The paper addresses a long-standing question within economics, which is whether recessions improve or worsen the productive efficiency of an economy. And we, I think, found a good way to address the question comprehensively by giving both channels a sort of fair chance at contributing to overall efficiency. And so in the paper, we show that in the medium run, what are called culling effects dominate. That is, that the productivity of the economy is depressed for a fairly long time after a strong enough shock hits. And I'm particularly excited about this result for two reasons. The first is that while the result can be ex ante somehow intuitive, the way it comes about is less clear ex ante, and we show it depends on the worsening of the human capital accumulation that comes from different sorting between workers and firms. So it's a less directly observable change. And the second reason why I'm excited, and I think it's the main reason why I find that project exciting, is because it takes a business cycle perspective, that is, something that generally is linked to short-term dynamics. And it gives an explanation for why things might change almost permanently because of something temporary. The economy might look very different because of a shock that happened in 2010. It might look very different still today. So this sort of long scars, this sort of long flowing rivers below the surface of the economy, I think it's very exciting to be able to put together empirical evidence and modeling and, get out of it and say something we see happening today might be the result of something happened 15 years ago, but we have actually a good trail to show this.
We will be able to read it in the American Economic Review shortly, right?
I hope so. Well, we are working at a revision. As it happens, a revision is not a promise of publication, but rather a set of instructions that the editor gives the authors. And if these instructions are carried out to the satisfaction of the referees and the editor, then the paper might get accepted in a subsequent round. So there's no guarantee, although we're very glad for the interest of the editor and the referees in our work that we are very proud of. And so we hope we will do enough to guarantee that the paper will see the light in that great journal.
Thank you, Luca. This was very informative, and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you very much. It was fun.